The village of St. Mary Mead was currently enjoying its most significant social upheaval of the year, the annual village fair. The air was a thick, sweet concoction of candy floss, damp grass, and the faint metallic tang of the Ferris wheel's gears. It was an event characterized by polite competition and the occasional, barely suppressed bout of horticultural jealousy. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a sensible tweed suit despite the mild August heat, sat on a folding chair near the refreshment tent, her pale blue eyes taking in the scene with a mixture of affection and clinical precision. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail old lady enjoying the festivities. In reality, she was cataloguing the tension in the local atmosphere, like a meteorologist noting the drop in pressure before a storm. The centerpiece of the fair was the great marquee, where the vegetable and flower competitions were judged. This year the stakes were unusually high due to the presence of Sir Geoffrey Sterling, a retired diplomat who had recently purchased the manor house and immediately set about offending the local sensibilities with his aggressive modernization. Sir Geoffrey was currently standing by the prize-winning marrow display, his face a vivid shade of crimson as he debated with Mrs. Pringle, the village's reigning queen of preserves. "I tell you, Sir Geoffrey," Mrs. Pringle's voice carried clearly across the lawn, "it is not merely about the size of the marrow, it is about skin consistency. Your specimen is, well, it's quite ostentatious, but it lacks the traditional soul of a St. Mary Mead harvest." Sir Geoffrey let out a sharp, bark-like laugh. "Tradition is just another word for stagnation, Mrs. Pringle. If this village spent as much time on innovation as it does on gossip, we'd be far better off." Watching from a distance were Dr. Graham, the local physician, whose weary expression suggested a man who had seen too many village crises, and Miss Isabella Thorne, a younger woman who had recently returned to the village to care for her aging mother. Isabella's hands were clutched tightly around her handbag, her gaze fixed on Sir Geoffrey with an intensity that Miss Marple found rather striking. It was the look of someone who was waiting for a clock to strike a very specific, perhaps unpleasant, hour. As the village band struck up a spirited, if slightly out of tune, rendition of the British Grenadiers, the grand moment arrived, the raffle draw. The prize, a magnificent silver punch bowl donated by the manor house, was perched on a velvet-covered pedestal at the center of the main stage. Sir Geoffrey stepped up to the microphone, his movements brisk and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming through the speakers, "I believe it is time to see who the lucky winner of this rather exquisite piece will be, though I suspect some of you would prefer it if I donated a prize for the best-kept secret in the village instead." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. Sir Geoffrey reached into the drum, swirled the tickets with a flourish, and pulled one out. He opened his mouth to announce the winner, but the words never came. Instead, a peculiar strangled sound escaped his throat. He clutched his chest, his eyes widening in a mask of sudden, profound surprise. He took one stumbling step back, his hand knocking the silver punch bowl off its pedestal with a deafening crash, before he collapsed entirely, falling forward into the floral arrangements. For a heartbeat, the village was silent. Then the screaming began. Dr. Graham was the first to reach the stage, pushing past a stunned Mrs. Pringle. Miss Marple did not run. She stood up slowly, her gaze sweeping across the front row of the spectators. She noticed how Miss Thorne's hand had flown to her mouth, not in shock, but as if to hide a smile. She saw how the local curate, Mr. Hinchcliffe, had turned remarkably pale and was looking not at Sir Geoffrey, but at the fallen silver bowl. "The poor man," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her fingers adjusting the strap of her knitting bag. "It is so very like old Mr. Timmins when he found the blight in his orchard. He was so focused on the fruit that he never noticed the roots were being eaten away by something much smaller." A very public end for a man who lived such a private, guarded life. She walked toward the stage, her pace steady. She didn't look at the body, which Dr. Graham was now pronouncing dead with a sombre shake of his head. Instead, she looked at the glass of water that had been sitting on Sir Geoffrey's lectern. A small, almost invisible film was shimmering on the surface of the liquid, a detail that the frantic crowd and the arriving constable would surely overlook in the chaos of the afternoon. The following morning, St. Mary Mead had collectively abandoned its interest in horticulture to focus on the much more exhilarating pursuit of character assassination. The annual village fair, once a source of civic pride, was now spoken of as if it were a scene from a sensationalist penny dreadful. At the village post office, which served as the unofficial headquarters for the distribution of local intelligence, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and malicious delight. Mrs. Pringle was already holding court near the stamp counter, her earlier confrontation with the late Sir Geoffrey now serving as a badge of honour. She insisted that the man's heart had simply failed him out of sheer arrogance, though she hinted darkly that his modernising habits had likely involved a diet of foreign spicy foods that no English constitution could reasonably be expected to withstand. Miss Marple stood quietly by the display of greeting cards, ostensibly searching for a birthday message for an old school friend, but her attention was focused entirely on the shifting currents of conversation. The theories being traded were as varied as they were improbable. Some suggested that Sir Geoffrey had been a secret agent for a Mediterranean power, and had been silenced by a poisoned dart disguised as a ticket in the raffle drum. Others, more grounded in local resentment, believed he had been driven to a fatal stroke by a clandestine dispute over the manor house boundaries. Miss Weatherby, who lived in a state of perpetual fluttery anxiety, whispered to anyone who would listen that she had seen a dark, sinister figure lurking behind the marquee just moments before the collapse, a figure that, upon closer questioning, bore a striking resemblance to the local chimney sweep. "It is a very curious thing, the way people see what they expect to see," Miss Marple remarked to the vicar's wife, who had just entered looking harassed. "When old Mr. Garnet's prize pig went missing last spring, half the village swore they had seen a gypsy caravan on the lane, when in fact the poor creature had merely wandered into the vicarage cellar through an open door. We seek the exotic when the truth is usually as local as the mud on our boots. Sir Geoffrey was a man who made many enemies in a very short time, and that is a much more dangerous thing than any foreign spy. The gossip took a more focused turn when Miss Isabella Thorne entered the shop. The chatter died down to a sharp, expectant hush. Isabella was dressed in a simple dark blue coat, her face pale but entirely composed. She ignored the stares and the sudden silence, purchasing a small bottle of aspirin and a tin of tea with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a great deal on her mind. Miss Marple noticed that while Isabella's hands were steady, her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had spent the night not in grief, but in a state of intense, sleepless calculation. Behind the counter, the postmaster's wife leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss the moment the door closed behind Isabella. "They say Sir Geoffrey ruined her father back in the 30s, out in the colonies, a tea plantation that went bust under mysterious circumstances. Isabella came back here specifically because she heard he'd bought the manor. It wasn't just to look after her mother, it was for a settling of accounts. And did you see her face when he fell? She didn't move an inch." "Not an inch." Miss Marple moved toward the door, her mind working through these new fragments of information. The mention of a colonial grievance was a pattern she recognized only too well. It reminded her of the Baxter family, who had harbored a resentment against the local magistrate for 3 generations over a disputed right-of-way. Such memories did not fade in the country. They tended like prize roses, pruned and watered, until they were ready to blossom into something far more lethal than a mere argument. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, her knitting needles resuming their rhythmic click-clack. She thought of the silver punch bowl and the way it had shattered on the stage. More importantly, she thought of the curate, Mr. Hinchcliffe, and the peculiar way he had avoided looking at Sir Geoffrey's body. In St. Mary Mead, the person who looks away from the tragedy is often looking at the cause. The village was reacting with its usual blend of fantasy and malice, but beneath the layers of gossip about foreign poisons and secret agents, the heavy sediment of a very old, very English betrayal was beginning to settle at the bottom of the cup. It was a pattern of historical debt and modern opportunity, and as the afternoon shadows lengthened across her garden, Miss Marple knew that the first suspect the police would choose would be the one with the most obvious story, and therefore, in her experience, the most likely to be innocent of the actual deed. By the time Inspector Slack arrived at the village police station, he was already in a state of high-strung irritability that the residents of St. Mary Mead had come to expect whenever a death occurred within their boundaries. Slack was a man who believed in the inherent logic of fingerprints and the undeniable honesty of a blood spatter. But a village fair death presented him with a logistical nightmare, a crime scene that had been trampled by 300 pairs of muddy boots. He had spent the morning interrogating Dr. Graham, who had been unable to provide a definitive cause of death beyond a sudden, catastrophic failure of the heart. To Slack, this was a personal affront. He did not like deaths that lacked a visible weapon, and he liked them even less when they involved a local dignitary like Sir Geoffrey Sterling. Miss Marple sat on a low stone wall outside the police station, her knitting bag perched on her knees, watching the inspector's frantic movements through the window. She had a way of appearing entirely inconspicuous, a fragment of the landscape that the busy police force overlooked as they hurried to and fro. When the curate, Mr. Hinchcliffe, emerged from the building looking remarkably shaken, she did not hesitate. She dropped a ball of wool, and as the young man stooped to retrieve it, she began the process of gentle, persistent observation that was her hallmark. "It is a very distressing business for a man of the cloth, is it not, Mr. Hinchcliffe?" she said, her voice like the soft rustle of autumn leaves. "To see a man struck down in his moment of triumph. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Abernathy, who collapsed while opening the new wing of the library. Everyone thought it was the excitement, but it turned out he had been worrying about a very small, very private matter involving the choir funds. Anxiety is a heavy burden to carry, especially when one is expected to be a pillar of the community. Mr. Hinchcliffe wiped his brow with a handkerchief that was noticeably frayed at the edges. "It is the suddenness, Miss Marple, the sheer, terrifying suddenness of it. Sir Geoffrey was not a popular man, I grant you, but he was a generous benefactor to the church roof fund. His loss will be felt in more ways than one." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "And yet you seemed quite focused on that silver punch bowl yesterday. A magnificent piece, though I couldn't help but notice it had a very peculiar dent in the rim even before it fell. It is a shame when something so beautiful is marred by a small, careless imperfection. Was it a family heirloom of Sir Geoffrey's, do you know?" The curate stammered for a moment, his eyes darting toward the village green. I believe so. He spoke of it as a piece with a long and storied history. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have many parishioners to visit. This tragedy has left everyone quite unmoored." As he scurried away, Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady work. She had noticed the way his hands had trembled when she mentioned the punch bowl. In her experience, men like Mr. Hinchcliffe did not tremble because they were grieving for a benefactor. They trembled because a benefactor's death had left a gap in a story they were struggling to tell. She then watched Inspector Slack emerge, his face flushed with anger, as he yelled for a constable to bring him the guest list for the Manor House dinner party held the previous Friday. Miss Marple stood up and made her way toward the great marquee, which was now silent and shadowed. The floral arrangements were wilting, their sweet scent turning to the cloying odor of decay. She found a young boy, the gardener's son, poking around the edges of the stage with a stick. With a few kind words and a peppermint from her pocket, she learned that the silver bowl had been polished by the curate himself only an hour before the raffle began. "He was very particular about it, Miss Marple," the boy whispered. "He wouldn't let no one else touch it, said it was too valuable for the likes of us." This was a pattern Miss Marple understood well. It reminded her of the time the churchwarden had insisted on cleaning the communion plate himself, only to discover he had accidentally scratched the surface while trying to hide a repair he had made without permission. People were often most protective of what they had faked. She looked at the spot where the bowl had fallen, and then at the lectern where the glass of water had stood. The small, shimmering film she had noticed earlier was gone now, likely dried by the morning sun, but the memory of it remained. It was a detail that did not fit a simple heart attack, nor did it fit a colonial revenge. It was a detail that suggested a very specific, very domestic kind of interference. As the inspector roared about motive and inheritance, Miss Marple was thinking about the chemistry of a polished surface and the peculiar, focused anxiety of a man of God. The early investigation was a chaos of noise, but in the silence of the marquee the first real threads of the truth were beginning to catch the light. By the following afternoon, Inspector Slack had convinced himself that the path to a quick resolution lay in the colonial archives of the manor house. He had discovered a series of private letters between the late Sir Geoffrey and Isabella Thorne's father, dated nearly 30 years ago. The correspondence was acrimonious, detailing a failed venture in the Ceylon tea trade that had left the Thorne family in financial ruin, while Sir Geoffrey emerged with a significant fortune. To Slack, this was the definitive motive. Isabella Thorne, a woman with a long memory and a motive for revenge, had returned to the village not as a nurse for her mother, but as an executioner. He spent the better part of the morning in a heated interview with the young woman, who remained remarkably calm despite his increasingly aggressive accusations about poisons from the East. Miss Marple sat in the corner of the local tea room, her pale blue eyes fixed on a small rectangular piece of paper she had retrieved from the bin near the raffle drum earlier that morning. It was a discarded raffle ticket, number 42, but it bore a peculiar stain, a faint, oily smudge that smelled remarkably of bitter almonds. It reminded her of the time the local chemist's daughter, young Mary Rose, had tried to hide the fact that she had been using her father's laboratory to make her own perfume. The scent of almonds was often associated with cyanide, of course, but it was also a characteristic of certain industrial solvents used in the restoration of antique metals. "It is a very striking coincidence, Raymond," she said softly to her nephew, who had arrived to escort her home, "that Sir Geoffrey should be so insistent on tradition, yet the curate was so insistent on modern polish. When people are very loud about one thing, it is usually because they are trying to drown out the sound of another. Isabella Thorne is certainly a woman of strong character, but she is also a woman of great honesty. She wouldn't use a raffle to settle a debt, she would use a solicitor. No, the raffle tickets were a distraction, but they were a very messy one for someone who is usually so tidy." She watched as Inspector Slack marched past the tea-room window, looking triumphant. He had just learned that Isabella had been seen in the manor house gardens on the evening of the dinner party, near the very window where the silver bowl was kept. To Slack, this was the final piece of the puzzle. But Miss Marple was thinking about the smudge on ticket 42. She had noticed that while Sir Geoffrey was swirling the tickets, he had been wearing a pair of light grey gloves. When he pulled the winning ticket, he paused for a moment, as if the paper had stuck to his thumb. "People assume a raffle is a game of luck," Miss Marple mused, her knitting needles clicking with a renewed sharp intensity. "But in a village like this, even luck is often managed by a steady hand. I noticed that the curate, Mr. Hinchcliffe, was the one preparing the drum. He was also the one who insisted that only Sir Geoffrey should draw the winner. It was a very gracious gesture, or perhaps a very necessary one. It reminds me of the time the local grocer tried to rig the Christmas hamper so his own sister would win. He didn't realize that the weight of the extra glue would make the ticket sink to the bottom of the drum. She stood up, her knitting bag tucked firmly under her arm. She knew that the police would continue to haunt Isabella Thorne, but she was more interested in the curate's sudden interest in the church roof fund. Sir Geoffrey had been a benefactor, yes, but he had also been a man of immense curiosity. If he had looked too closely at the silver bowl he was donating, perhaps noticing that the dent she had seen was actually a sign of a very clever, very modern plating job, the curate's reputation would have been destroyed. The first suspects are always the ones with the most obvious drama, but the real culprit is often the one who is trying to save a very small, very fragile world from collapsing. As she walked toward the vicarage, Miss Marple noticed a small red-inked stamp on the back of her raffle ticket. It was a mark she recognized from the church's private inventory. The puzzle was no longer about a colonial revenge, it was about a silver bowl that wasn't silver, a raffle that wasn't random, and a man of God who had become a man of shadows. The pattern was emerging, a dark and intricate web of financial desperation and chemical ingenuity. And as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, Miss Marple knew that the inspector's open and shut case against Isabella Thorne was about to be blown wide open by a single oily smudge of bitter almonds. The morning mist was still clinging to the yew trees in the churchyard when Miss Marple made her way toward the vestry door. She moved with a purpose that belied her frail appearance, her mind revolving around the peculiar properties of silver and the even more peculiar behavior of those charged with its care. The church of St. Mary Mead was a sanctuary of ancient stone and polished brass, but even here the secular world of debt and deception had a way of seeping through the cracks. While Inspector Slack was busy cataloguing Isabella Thorne's childhood diaries, Miss Marple was more interested in the small locked cupboard where the church's cleaning supplies were kept. Through a series of polite inquiries to the sexton about the best way to remove tarnish from a set of silver candlesticks, she found herself alone in the vestry for a few brief moments. It was a small, cramped room that smelled of incense and damp wool. She did not have to search long. Tucked at the very back of a shelf, hidden behind a stack of hymnals that hadn't been touched in years, was a small amber glass bottle. It lacked a commercial label, but its stopper was encrusted with a dry white residue. Miss Marple uncorked it delicately and inhaled. The scent was unmistakable, the sharp, biting aroma of bitter almonds. A very specialized solution, she whispered to herself, her eyes tracking the dust patterns on the shelf. It reminds me so much of the time the local watchmaker, Mr. Crabtree, tried to pass off a plated watch as solid gold. He used a very similar chemical to strip away the old finish so the new plating would adhere more smoothly. The smell stayed in his shop for weeks. People think of almonds as a pleasant thing, but in the wrong concentration they are a harbinger of a very different kind of finality. She replaced the bottle exactly where she had found it, her fingers brushing against a small discarded rag that lay nearby. The cloth was stained with a dark metallic grey, the unmistakable byproduct of intensive silver polishing. In St. Mary Mead, such a rag was a common domestic item, but in this specific context, it was a fragment of a much larger confession. The silver punch bowl donated by Sir Geoffrey had been a magnificent piece, but Miss Marple now understood that its magnificence had been a carefully maintained illusion. The curate had not been polishing it for the fair. He had been restoring a forgery that Sir Geoffrey, with his diplomat's eye for detail, was almost certain to have noticed during the public presentation. As she left the church, she encountered Mr. Hinchcliffe coming through the lich gate. He looked more haggard than the previous day, his eyes darting toward the vestry as if he could sense the disturbance in its atmosphere. Miss Marple offered him a cheerful, slightly distracted smile, "The church looks so lovely this morning, Mr. Hinchcliffe. It is such a comfort to have such a dedicated guardian for our local treasures. I was just telling the sexton how much I admired the shine on that silver bowl before the accident. It really was quite a remarkable transformation. It looked almost brand new, didn't it?" The curate's face went a shade of pale that was nearly translucent. "Yes, quite new. It was a great responsibility, Miss Marple. Sir Geoffrey was very particular about his donations. If you'll excuse me, I have the morning service to prepare for. It is a time for reflection, after all." Miss Marple watched him go, her knitting needles resuming their steady click-clack in her bag. The hidden clue was not just the bottle of solvent, but the desperation that had placed it there. The curate had been embezzling from the roof fund, a fact she had suspected since she noticed the new tiles on his mother's cottage, and the silver bowl had been his attempt to bridge the gap. He had replaced the original manor house heirloom with a clever, plated imitation intending to sell the real silver to cover his tracks. But Sir Geoffrey's decision to draw the winner himself had threatened everything. The accident on the stage was not a heart attack, it was a desperate chemical intervention. The almond scent on the raffle ticket had been the delivery system. The winning ticket had been treated with a concentrated, volatile solution that, when handled by a man with Sir Geoffrey's specific cardiac history, would cause an immediate and fatal reaction. She sat on a bench overlooking the green, watching the constable post a notice about the adjourned inquest. The police were looking for a woman with a 30-year-old grudge, but Miss Marple had found a man with a 30-day-old panic. The pattern was shifting from the grand drama of colonial revenge to the small, pathetic tragedy of a man who had tried to save his reputation by sacrificing his soul. The silver was a lie, the raffle was a trap, and the curate was waiting for the shadows to swallow his secret. But in St. Mary Mead, the shadows were where Miss Marple did her best work, and the scent of bitter almonds was a trail that led directly to the altar. The following afternoon, the air in the vicarage study was thick with the scent of old leather and the stifling weight of a secret that had grown too large for its surroundings. Miss Marple sat in a straight-backed chair, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic, unrelenting precision that seemed to vibrate against the silence. Across from her, the curate, Mr. Hinchcliffe, was ostensibly sorting through the latest invoices for the church roof repairs, but his hands were trembling so violently that the papers rattled like dry leaves in a gale. The confrontation was not loud. Miss Marple did not believe in scenes, preferring instead the gentle, steady application of the truth until the cracks began to show. "It is a very heavy burden, Mr. Hinchcliffe, trying to keep a roof over one's head while keeping a roof over the church," Miss Marple began, her voice as soft as a prayer. "I happen to notice that the new slate on your mother's cottage is of an exceptionally fine quality. It reminds me so much of the time the local postmaster in St. Mary Mead tried to build an extension on his shop, using funds meant for the pension wall. He was a good man at heart, but he found himself in a position where the interest on his debts was growing faster than his ability to pay them. He thought a small temporary loan from the community would go unnoticed, provided he could find a way to replace it before the annual audit." Mr. Hinchcliffe dropped his pen, the ink staining his thumb a dark, indelible blue. "I don't know what you are suggesting, Miss Marple. The roof fund is a matter of public record. Sir Geoffrey's donation was meant to be the final piece of the puzzle. His death has left us in a precarious position, certainly, but it is a tragedy of health, not of finance." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked, her pale blue eyes fixing on his with a sharp, unwavering clarity. "Sir Geoffrey was a diplomat, Mr. Hinchcliffe. He spent 30 years in foreign courts where the difference between a real diamond and a clever paste imitation could mean the difference between a successful treaty and a national scandal. He was not a man who would donate a silver punch bowl without knowing exactly what it was worth, and I believe that on the Friday evening before the fair, when he invited you to the manor house to collect the bowl, He told you that he intended to have it appraised by a specialist from London the very morning after the fair. He wanted the village to know the exact value of his generosity. The curate's breath hitched in his throat, a small, involuntary sound of despair. Miss Marple continued, her needles never faltering. You had already taken the original bowl, hadn't you? You sold it to a dealer in town weeks ago to pay the builders. You thought you could replace it with a plated replica, and no one in the village would ever know the difference. But Sir Geoffrey's appraisal would have exposed the theft. You weren't just polishing that bowl in the vestry, Mr. Hinchcliffe. You were desperately trying to strip away the chemical signature of the plating process so it would pass a casual inspection. But even then, you knew it wouldn't be enough. Sir Geoffrey had to be stopped from announcing the winner, because the winner would have taken that bowl home, and eventually the truth would have come out. You have no proof of this, Hinchcliffe whispered, his face ghostly in the fading light. Sir Geoffrey died of a heart attack. Dr. Graham said so himself. A heart attack can be triggered by many things, Miss Marple replied, especially in a man with a known cardiac condition. The bottle of solvent I found in the vestry, the one that smells so strongly of bitter almonds, is a highly volatile chemical. When applied to a porous surface like a raffle ticket, it creates a concentrated vapor. When Sir Geoffrey leaned in to draw the ticket, he inhaled a dose of a substance that acts as a powerful stimulant to the heart. In a healthy man, it might have caused only a momentary dizziness. In Sir Geoffrey, it was a death sentence. You didn't even have to be on the stage, did you? You just had to ensure that he drew the one ticket that had been prepared, the winning ticket which was never meant to be won at all. The curate sank back into his chair, the defiance draining from his posture like water from a broken vessel. The secrets of St. Mary Mead were never buried as deeply as their perpetrators hoped. Miss Marple watched him, not with anger, but with a profound, quiet sadness. She had seen the same pattern in a dozen different forms over the years, the small compromise that leads to the large betrayal. The curate had started with a roof and ended with a murder, and all for the sake of a silver bowl that had never truly belonged to him. The confrontation was over, though the official reckoning was yet to come. As she stood up to leave, Miss Marple noticed a single silver-grey smudge on the curate's cuff, the last lingering evidence of the lie he had tried to polish into a truth. The stillness that followed Miss Marple's departure from the vicarage was short-lived, for a new and startling development at the manor house was about to turn the investigation on its head once again. Inspector Slack, having finished his exhaustive and ultimately fruitless search of Isabella Thorne's childhood belongings, had turned his attention to Sir Geoffrey's private study. Behind a false front of leather-bound volumes on international law, he discovered a hidden safe containing a document that sent him racing back to the village green in a state of agitated triumph. It was not a confession or a will, but a private contract with a London auction house, dated only 3 days before the fair. The document revealed that Sir Geoffrey had not been donating a family heirloom at all. He had recently purchased a second, identical punch bowl, a perfect replica, intending to keep the original for his private collection. This revelation created a chaotic shift in the narrative. If Sir Geoffrey had knowingly provided a replica, then the curate's frantic attempts to hide the forgery were both redundant and tragically misguided. However, the twist went deeper. Inside the same safe, Slack found a small velvet-lined box containing the real silver bowl, but it was accompanied by a note in Sir Geoffrey's bold, arrogant hand. The note indicated that he was well aware that the church roof fund had been tampered with. He had intended to use the raffle to publicly expose the curate's embezzlement by having the winner's silver bowl fail a public acid test on the stage. Sir Geoffrey had not been a victim of a secret he was about to discover. He had been the architect of a public humiliation that he never lived to complete. Miss Marple sat on a bench overlooking the village pond, her knitting needles clicking with a renewed, thoughtful vigour. Raymond West stood beside her, looking utterly confused by the latest turn of events. "It's a complete reversal, Aunt Jane," Raymond said, shaking his head. If Sir Geoffrey knew about the theft and was planning to expose Hinchcliffe, then the curate's motive for murder is even stronger. But Slack has found something else. A third raffle ticket, number 42, tucked into Sir Geoffrey's own pocket. It seems he intended to win the bowl himself to ensure the demonstration went exactly as planned. He was going to be his own witness. "It is a very complex way to be unkind, Raymond," Miss Marple replied, her gaze fixed on a swan drifting near the reeds. Sir Geoffrey was a man who enjoyed the theatre of power. He didn't just want justice, he wanted a performance. It reminds me so much of old Mrs. Gable, who used to leave a sovereign on the kitchen floor just to see if the new maid would pick it up. She didn't want the money, she wanted the satisfaction of catching someone in a moment of weakness. But when you play such games with humans, you often find that the trap you set has two sides. Sir Geoffrey thought he was the cat, but he didn't realize that the mouse had already found the poison. The discovery of the real bowl and the diplomat's plan reinforced the curate's guilt, but it also introduced a chilling new element to the crime. If Sir Geoffrey had intended to draw his own winning ticket, he had effectively walked into his own execution with his eyes wide open. He had ensured that he would be the one to handle the contaminated paper. The twist of his secret knowledge didn't clear the curtain. It merely proved that the predator and the prey had been moving toward each other in a fatal dance, each believing they held the upper hand. Miss Marple, however, was focused on a different detail. She was thinking about the third ticket in Sir Geoffrey's pocket. If he had intended to draw ticket 42, how had he known which one it would be? The curate had prepared the drum, but Sir Geoffrey was not a man to leave his luck to chance. It suggested a level of collusion or a shared secret that went beyond simple embezzlement. She realized now that the raffle hadn't just been a trap for the curate, it had been a game of mutually assured destruction. As Inspector Slack began to arrest Mr. Hinchcliffe on the steps of the church, Miss Marple noticed a small discarded envelope in the gutter near the manor house gates. It bore the crest of a local chemical supplier, and was addressed not to the curate, but to Isabella Thorne. The pattern was shifting again, revealing a third layer of deception that made the curate's panic look like a mere diversion for a much more patient, much more ruthless revenge. The sun was beginning to dip behind the spire of St. Mary Mead's church, casting long skeletal shadows across the manor house gardens. Miss Marple sat on a weathered stone bench near the lily pond, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic, hypnotic pace that seemed to match the slow pulse of the village evening. She was not alone. Isabella Thorne stood by the water's edge, her silhouette sharp and dark against the reflecting pool. The young woman had been remarkably quiet since the inspector's dramatic discovery in the safe, her composure so absolute that it had begun to feel like a physical barrier. Miss Marple, however, knew that even the most perfect ice eventually shows a hairline fracture if the temperature is raised just a fraction of a degree. "It is a very beautiful garden, Isabella," Miss Marple began, her voice a gentle murmur that barely disturbed the air. "Sir Geoffrey spent a great deal of money to make it perfect, but a garden, like a life, can never be entirely controlled. There is always a weed that survives the poison, or a seed that remains dormant for decades only to bloom when the conditions are exactly right. It reminds me so much of your father's tea plantation in Ceylon. He was a man who loved the land, yet he was ruined by someone who only loved the profit. A very bitter fruit to swallow, I should think, especially when the person responsible is living in a manor house while your own family struggles in a small cottage." Isabella did not turn around. Her voice was cool and detached. "My father was a man of honor, Miss Marple." "Honor is a commodity that Sir Geoffrey never understood. But as you say, he is dead now. The debt is settled in a manner of speaking. The inspector has his curate, and the village has its scandal. Surely that is enough for one afternoon. "It is enough for the inspector, certainly," Miss Marple replied, pausing to adjust a stitch in her wool. "Mr. Slack is a man of very direct lines. He sees the curate's embezzlement and the curate's bottle of solvent, and he is satisfied. But I find myself thinking about the chemistry of it all. You see, Mr. Hinchcliffe is a very nervous man, Isabella. He is the sort of man who would panic and hide a bottle, but he is not the sort of man who would know exactly how to stabilize a volatile vapor so that it only acted at a specific moment. That requires a very particular kind of education, the kind one might receive if one had spent years studying the botanical and chemical properties of tropical plants." Isabella turned then, her eyes like polished flint in the twilight. "I studied botany because I enjoyed it, Miss Marple, not because I intended to become an assassin. If the curate chose to use a solvent he found in the vestry, that is his own sin."
"Oh, I agree," Miss Marple said, her blue eyes bright and unwavering. "The curate certainly thought he was the one in control. He thought he was the one who treated the ticket. But I wonder, Isabella, if you didn't help him. It is so easy to suggest a solution to a desperate man. A word here about a cleaning agent, a gift there of a special polish. You knew Sir Geoffrey was planning a public humiliation for the curate. You knew he would draw ticket 42 because he told you so himself during that dinner party on Friday. You see, I found the chemical supplier's envelope. It wasn't for the solvent the curate used, it was for a catalyst, a substance that makes a volatile chemical far more lethal when it is warmed by the heat of a human hand." Miss Marple reached into her bag and pulled out a small dried leaf, holding it up to the fading light. "This is from a very specific type of lily that grows near the manor gates. It is harmless to the touch, but when crushed and mixed with the chemical I found on the raffle drum, it creates a reaction that mimics a heart attack perfectly. I noticed a few crushed leaves on your gloves when you arrived at the fair. Such a small thing, isn't it? Just a bit of gardening. But when Sir Geoffrey reached into that drum, he wasn't just touching a ticket, he was touching the culmination of 30 years of waiting. You didn't kill him, Isabella. You simply provided the environment for his own trap to become fatal. You let the curate think he was the master of the game, while you were the one who ensured the cat didn't survive the pounce. The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella Thorne did not flinch, but her hands tightened around the stone railing until her knuckles were white. She looked at the elderly lady, not with fear, but with a profound, terrifying recognition. Miss Marple had not looked for fingerprints or alibis. She had looked for the psychological weight of a long-held grudge and the botanical knowledge of a ruined daughter. The final test had been passed. Isabella's lack of denial was more eloquent than any confession. She stood there, a figure of ice and stone, as Miss Marple slowly packed away her knitting. The pattern was revealed, a murder committed by a proxy who never knew he was a tool, orchestrated by a woman who had simply waited for the perfect moment to turn a man's own cruelty against him. The gathering in the manor house drawing-room was a sombre affair, draped in the heavy velvet curtains and the oppressive scent of beeswax that characterized Sir Geoffrey's tenure. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, looking remarkably pleased with himself as he clutched the warrant for the curate's formal arrest. To Slack, the case was a masterpiece of investigative simplicity, embezzlement, a bottle of solvent, and a desperate man of the cloth. He was prepared to close his notebook and return to the city, but Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a floral armchair with her knitting bag at her feet, had a very different conclusion to offer. Her presence was as unassuming as a shadow, yet when she spoke, the room seemed to shrink around her soft, measured tones. "It is a very tidy story, Inspector," Miss Marple began, her needles clicking a gentle rhythm that seemed to pace the tension in the room, "and Mr. Hinchcliffe is certainly a man who has succumbed to a very human weakness. He stole from the roof fund, and he tried to hide that theft with a plated forgery. But in St. Mary Mead, we have learned that while a man might be a thief, it does not necessarily mean he is a murderer.
It reminds me so much of the time the local butcher was accused of stealing a side of beef, when in fact he was merely trying to hide the fact that his refrigeration had failed. He was guilty of a lapse, certainly, but he lacked the cold, calculated heart required for a killing. Slack frowned, his face reddening. He had the solvent, Miss Marple. He had the almond-scented chemical. He had the motive to stop the appraisal. What more do you want? It's an open and shut case. It is a case with many doors, Inspector, and you have only opened the most obvious one, Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes turning toward Isabella Thorne, who sat motionless by the window. Mr. Hinchcliffe did indeed treat the raffle ticket with a solvent, but that solvent was intended only to blur the ink, to make the winning ticket unreadable so that Sir Geoffrey could not announce the result. It was a panicked, clumsy plan, but the substance that actually killed Sir Geoffrey was not in that bottle. It was a catalyst, a rare botanical extract that turns a mild irritant into a deadly cardiac stimulant when exposed to the specific temperature of a human thumb. And that, Inspector, is not something a curate finds in a vestry cupboard. It is something a botanist brings with her from the colonies. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. Miss Marple continued, her gaze unwavering. Isabella Thorne knew everything. She knew of the curate's embezzlement because she had seen the invoices at her mother's cottage. She knew of Sir Geoffrey's plan to humiliate the curate because she had been his confidant at dinner. She didn't discourage the curate's panic. She nurtured it. She suggested the use of the solvent, ostensibly to help him, while secretly adding the catalyst she had prepared from the lilies in the manor garden. She knew Sir Geoffrey would draw the ticket himself, and she knew his heart would not withstand the reaction. She didn't have to pull a trigger or swing a blade. She simply sat in the front row and watched as two men she despised destroyed each other in a single choreographed moment. Isabella Thorne did not move, but her silence had changed its quality. It was no longer the silence of the innocent, but the heavy, frozen stillness of a woman who had seen her masterpiece unveiled. Miss Marple sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "You see, Inspector, the curate was the weapon, but Isabella was the hand that aimed it. She used a man's guilt to mask her own revenge. It was a cold, clinical settling of an old family debt, disguised as a village scandal. The silver bowl was the bait, the curate was the hook, and Sir Geoffrey was the prize. It is the most ruthless kind of murder, for it leaves the perpetrator's hands entirely clean while another person carries the brand of Cain. The logic was as cold and precise as the chemistry it described. Miss Marple explained how the oily smudge on the ticket was a composite of two distinct substances that only became lethal when joined. She pointed out that the curate's ignorance of the catalyst was evident in his own survival. Had he known the true nature of the mixture, he would never have handled the drum without protection. Isabella, however, had worn gloves throughout the afternoon, ostensibly for the sun, but in reality for her own safety. The pattern was complete. The inspector's simple case had been revealed as a three-dimensional chess game played by a woman who had waited 30 years to see a diplomat fall. As Slack began to realize the implications, the room felt colder, the cozy village mystery having peeled back to reveal a dark botanical vengeance that left no room for mercy. The following week, St. Mary Mead seemed to shrink back into itself, much like a tortoise retracting its head after a particularly jarring encounter with a stone. The great marquee had been dismantled, the flattened grass where it once stood already beginning to turn a pale, sickly yellow. The annual village fair was no longer discussed in the vibrant tones of local triumph, but in the hushed, hurried whispers of people who found the truth far more unsettling than the mystery. The arrest of Isabella Thorne, followed closely by the formal charging of Mr. Hinchcliffe for embezzlement and manslaughter, had left a void in the village's social structure that no amount of tea and sympathy could quite fill. The manor house stood silent, its windows staring out over the green like sightless eyes, as the legal executors began the long, dry process of untangling Sir Geoffrey's complicated and often cruel estate. Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles moving with their accustomed comforting rhythm. The wool was a soft heather grey, a colour that seemed appropriate for the quiet melancholy of the afternoon. Beside her, the sun-drenched stones of her cottage wall held the heat of the day, and the scent of lavender was heavy in the air. It was a scene of perfect domestic peace, yet Miss Marple's thoughts were far away, wandering through the tea plantations of Ceylon and the dusty, desperate corners of the human conscience. She was thinking of the nature of justice, which so often arrived in a form that no one expected and even fewer welcomed. "It is a very sad business, Jane," murmured Dolly Bantry, who had come over with a basket of plums and a heart full of unanswered questions. "To think that Isabella could harbour such a cold, quiet hatred for so long, and the curate, a man we all trusted to guide us. It makes one feel as though the very ground beneath the village is made of shifting sand. We look at a face every day for years, and we never truly know what is happening behind the eyes. Is it always like this? Is everyone keeping a secret that could destroy them?" Miss Marple paused, her needles stilled for a brief moment. "Not everyone, Dolly, but most of us have a small room in our hearts where we keep the things we cannot forgive. The tragedy is not that the secret exists, but that we allow it to grow until it occupies the whole house. Isabella Thorne didn't just kill Sir Geoffrey, she allowed her father's ruin to become her own identity. She spent 30 years building a tomb, and she simply waited for the right person to walk into it. It reminds me so much of poor Mrs. Abercrombie in the village. She was so convinced the baker was overcharging her that she spent all her time weighing her bread and none of her time eating it. In the end, she starved to death out of pure spite. Revenge is a very poor diet for the soul. The village pond was still, the water lilies drifting peacefully where Isabella had stood only days before. The curate's mother had been moved to a nursing home in the next county, her cottage already listed for sale, the new slate roof a mocking testament to her son's misguided devotion. The silver punch bowl, the real one, had been taken away as evidence, a heavy, silent witness to the vanity of a man who thought he could play with human lives as if they were pieces on a diplomatic board. In the end, the miracle of the fair had been nothing more than the intersection of two different kinds of greed, the curate's greed for security and Isabella's greed for a past that could never be restored. "I suppose things will go back to normal eventually," Dolly said, though she sounded unconvinced. "We shall have the harvest festival and the Christmas play, and we will talk about the weather and the price of eggs. But I don't think I shall ever be able to look at a raffle ticket without a shiver." "Normal is a very flexible word, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her eyes following the flight of a swallow as it dipped toward the eaves. "The village will heal, as it always does. We will find new things to gossip about, and new scandals will replace the old ones. But the patterns remain the same. Human nature does not change, whether it is in a colonial plantation or an English garden. We are all capable of great kindness and great cruelty. The difference is often nothing more than a single, small choice made in the dark. I find that the older I get, the more I appreciate the simple things. A good cup of tea, a garden that behaves itself, and the knowledge that the truth, however painful, is always better than a comfortable lie." She picked up her knitting once more, the soft click of the needles the only sound in the quiet garden. The shadows were lengthening, and the first evening star was beginning to twinkle above the church spire. The mystery of the annual village fair was over, the threads were tied, and the account was settled. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of the earth and the flowers, content to let the world turn at its own pace. She had seen darkness and light, and for now at least the light was enough.